The word no had never echoed through the grand rotunda of the Galactic Council before that day. I remember it with a clarity that borders on physical pain, because I was the one standing at the diplomatic podium when it happened, and I was the one who had to explain to 4,000 species why a civilization that still burned fossil fuels had just done something no one in 11,000 years of recorded galactic history had ever attempted. They said no, not, we need more time, not, we have concerns, not, let us consult our leaders, just, no, one word, 2 letters in their dominant language. And the silence that followed was so absolute that I could hear the atmospheric processors cycling air through the ventilation ducts 3 levels above us. My name is Yathal Sinori. I held the title of Senior Diplomatic Liaison for the Galactic Council's Integration Division, which is a formal way of saying I was the one they sent to smile at new species and hand them the welcome package. It was supposed to be the easiest job in the galaxy. Every species we contacted accepted. Every single one. The Voron accepted within hours. The Drelkathi threw a planetary celebration. The Ikral swarm integrated so quickly that their military was folded into the Council's enforcement arm before their ambassador had finished reading the second page. That was the pattern. That was always the pattern. Find a developing civilization, present the accession package, watch them weep with gratitude, file the paperwork, move on. Earth was flagged by our long-range survey probes 18 months before first contact. Tier 9 civilization, pre-faster-than-light travel, fractured governance with no unified planetary authority, still using combustion-based energy systems on a world they were actively poisoning. The assessment team classified them as a standard integration. I was assigned the file because it was considered so routine that it barely warranted a senior liaison. My supervisor told me I could handle it between lunch and my afternoon briefing. I assembled the welcome fleet, 12 diplomatic cruisers, arranged in the standard crescent formation that we used for every first contact. We translated the accession package into their 7 most widely spoken languages. We prepared cultural sensitivity briefings. We rehearsed the greeting protocols. Everything was textbook. When we arrived in their orbit, I expected panic. Every other pre-FTL species had reacted to our arrival with some combination of terror, awe, and frantic attempts at communication. The Voron had launched every aircraft they possessed in a defensive scramble that lasted 6 hours before they realized we were not hostile. The Drelkathi had broadcast religious hymns on every frequency they could reach, convinced we were divine messengers. Humanity did neither of those things. They went quiet for approximately 40 minutes, which I later learned was the time it took for their various national governments to confirm with each other that the objects in their sky were real and not a weapons test by a rival nation. Then they sent a single transmission on a broadband frequency that cut through every channel we were monitoring. 2 words, we're listening. Not who are you, or what do you want, or please don't destroy us. Just, we're listening. As if they had been waiting, as if this was a meeting they had always expected to take, and they were simply ready for us to begin. I delivered the accession package via direct transmission. It was the same package we had offered to every species since the Council's founding. Membership in the Galactic Council, full trade rights with all member civilizations, access to faster-than-light travel technology, military protection under the Council's collective security framework, medical advances that could extend their natural lifespan by decades, energy systems that would solve every resource crisis on their planet within a generation. All they had to do was sign the Unification Compact, the governing document that outlined the rights and responsibilities of member species. It was, by any objective measure, the most generous offer any civilization could receive. We were handing them the stars. Every species before them had recognized that immediately. Some had cried. Some had prayed. One species had composed an entire symphony in our honor before the ink was dry. 48 hours after I sent the package, Earth responded. The transmission came from a coordinated relay system they had hastily assembled, linking several of their largest communication arrays into a single unified broadcast. The message was brief and formal. It thanked us for the offer. It acknowledged the significance of the contact. And then it said, with what I would later come to understand was characteristically human directness, that they respectfully declined. No. I checked the translation software 3 times. I had my linguistics team review the original transmission in every language it had been simultaneously broadcast in: English, Mandarin, Spanish, Arabic, Hindi, French, and Russian. Every version said the same thing: "Thank you, but no." I reported the refusal to the council. The reaction was not alarm. It was amusement. Senior delegates from the Drayan hegemony laughed openly during my briefing. The Velthari Communion's representative suggested that the translation software had malfunctioned. The Ikral Swarm's liaison, a towering figure named Kravith who rarely spoke in council sessions, simply stared at me as if I had told a joke he did not understand. My supervisor told me to send the package again. "Simplify the language," she said. "Add visual aids. They are a primitive species. They probably do not understand what they are refusing." I sent it again. I added detailed projections showing how council membership would transform their civilization. I included holographic demonstrations of FTL technology. I attached medical data showing the diseases we could cure, the lifespans we could extend, the suffering we could end. I made the offer so clear and so compelling that refusing it would be like refusing to breathe. Their response arrived in 12 hours this time, faster than before. The same answer. They appreciated the additional information. They found it fascinating, and they declined. I sent it a 3rd time, because my supervisor insisted, and because I genuinely could not believe what was happening. This time I included a personal message, a direct appeal from me to whoever was reading these transmissions on the other end. I told them that in 11,000 years, no species had ever refused. I told them that the galaxy was vast and often dangerous, and that the Council's protection was not something to be taken lightly. I told them, with complete sincerity, that I was trying to help them. The response came in 6 hours. It was longer than the previous ones. It acknowledged my personal appeal. It thanked me for my concern. It expressed genuine interest in establishing communication and cultural exchange with the Council. And then, with a politeness that somehow made the refusal even more bewildering, it said no, again, for the 3rd time. I brought the refusals to my supervisor's morning briefing. She listened to my report with the expression of someone waiting for the punchline of a joke that was taking too long to arrive. When I finished, she asked me if I had considered the possibility that the humans simply did not have a unified government capable of accepting on behalf of their entire species. I told her. That was precisely what made the refusal so remarkable. They did not have a unified government. They had dozens of competing governments, spread across every continent, locked in perpetual disagreement about virtually everything. And yet, somehow, every single one of them had agreed on this. The one thing 8 billion people on a fractured planet could find consensus on was that the Council's offer was something they did not want. My supervisor stared at me for several seconds. Then she told me to take a rest day and approach the problem fresh. I stopped sleeping well after the 3rd refusal, not because I was angry. I had dealt with difficult negotiations before. The Velthari Communion had taken 9 months to finalize their membership terms, though they had never actually refused the offer itself. No, I stopped sleeping because something about the human response pattern was triggering an instinct I could not name. They were not confused. Their transmissions were articulate, well-organized, and demonstrated a clear understanding of what they were being offered. They were not hostile. Every message was courteous. They were not afraid. There was no trace of the desperate bravado that sometimes accompanied species who felt threatened. They were calm, they were measured, and they kept saying no. I began reading everything our survey probes had collected about human civilization, their history, their literature, their political systems, their wars, especially their wars. I read about conflicts fought over resources, over territory, over ideas. I read about alliances formed and broken, treaties signed and violated, promises made and discarded. I read about something they called colonialism, where powerful nations had arrived on the shores of less powerful ones, bearing gifts and promises of partnership, and I felt the first cold thread of understanding begin to wind its way through my thoughts. But I pushed that understanding aside because it was uncomfortable, and because my supervisor was now receiving daily inquiries from the Council about why a Tier 9 species was still unintegrated. She told me to send the package a 4th time. I did. The answer was the same. The 5th time, I added a veiled warning. Nothing threatening, nothing that violated diplomatic protocol, but a carefully worded reminder that the galaxy could be an inhospitable place for a species without allies. I am not proud of that message, but I was under pressure, and I was beginning to feel something I had never felt in my career. I was beginning to feel like I was losing. The human response to my fifth attempt arrived in 3 hours, the shortest turnaround yet. It contained no anger, no alarm, and no change in their position. But it did contain something new. A question. Just one. Simple and devastating in its implications. They asked what happened to species that accepted the compact and later wished to leave. I sat in my quarters aboard the diplomatic cruiser and stared at that question for a long time. I stared at it because I did not have an answer. Not because the answer was complicated, but because in 11,000 years of the Galactic Council's existence, no species had ever asked. No species had ever even considered the possibility. The compact was a gift. Why would anyone want to leave? I forwarded the question to the Council's legal division. They took 4 days to respond, which was unusual for a department that typically processed inquiries within hours. When the answer finally came, it was 3 pages of diplomatic language that, when stripped of its careful phrasing, said essentially nothing. The compact did not contain a withdrawal clause. It had never needed one. No species had ever wanted to leave. I did not send that answer to the humans. Something stopped me. That cold thread of understanding had grown into something larger, something I was not yet ready to examine. Instead, I sat in the silence of my quarters and read the Unification Compact from beginning to end for the first time in my career. It took me 7 hours, not because it was long, though it was, but because I kept stopping. I kept stopping because I was finding things I had never noticed before, buried in subclauses and appendices that I had never had reason to read. And with every clause I uncovered, the cold thread wound tighter, and the silence in my quarters grew heavier, and the human question echoed louder in my mind. What happens to species that want to leave? I filed my report the next morning. I recommended patience. I recommended continued dialogue. I recommended, in the strongest terms I could use without directly criticizing the Council, that we not attempt to pressure this species into compliance. The Council received my report. They noted my recommendations, and then they ignored every single one of them. That was when the panic truly began, not the quiet, professional concern that had characterized the first few weeks. Real panic. The kind that makes powerful beings do desperate things. Because the Council had finally realized what I had begun to suspect from the moment I read that single, devastating question. The humans were not refusing out of ignorance. They were refusing because they understood the offer better than the species that had written it. And that, as I would soon discover, terrified the Council more than any weapon ever could. I had served the Galactic Council for 31 years before the human crisis, and in all that time, I had never seen the Grand Rotunda filled to capacity for an emergency session. The rotunda was designed to hold representatives from every member species simultaneously, which meant it could seat over 12,000 delegates in tiered rings that rose from the central speaking platform like the interior of an enormous bowl. On normal legislative days, perhaps a third of those seats were occupied. Most species sent small delegations and monitored proceedings remotely. On the day the Council convened to discuss humanity's fourth refusal, every seat was filled. Species that had not sent physical representatives in decades had dispatched emergency delegations. The atmospheric processors were working at maximum capacity to accommodate the breathing requirements of 4,000 different biological configurations. The noise was extraordinary, a layered wall of sound that combined clicks, whistles, subsonic vibrations, and every other form of vocalization the galaxy had produced. I stood at the speaking platform and delivered my report. I kept my voice steady. I presented the facts as they were, not as the Council wanted them to be. Humanity had refused the accession package 4 times. Each refusal had been polite, articulate, and final. The humans had asked a question about withdrawal from the compact that the Council's legal division had been unable to answer clearly. And my professional assessment, based on extensive study of human history and communication patterns, was that further repetition of the same offer would produce the same result. The questions from the delegates began immediately, and they came with a ferocity that surprised me. Delegate Saythorn, of the Drayan hegemony, a species known for their commercial instincts, was the first to speak. His theory was simple. The humans were negotiating. They were refusing the standard package because they wanted a better deal. In his experience, every species had a price. We simply had not found humanity's yet. I told Delegate Saythorn that I did not believe the humans were negotiating in any way he would recognize. They had not asked for better terms. They had not proposed alternatives. They had not attempted to leverage their refusal into a stronger bargaining position. They had simply said no. Saythorn dismissed my assessment with a wave of his upper appendage and proposed what he called an enhanced integration package. Triple the standard technology transfer. Immediate full voting rights on 3 major trade councils, a privilege normally reserved for species with at least a century of membership. A dedicated FTL transit corridor connecting their system to the 7 busiest commercial hubs in the galaxy. Medical technology that would not merely extend human lifespans but could potentially double them. The package was so generous that several delegates from established member species openly objected, arguing that their own civilizations had received far less upon integration. The Council approved Saythorn's package by a narrow margin. I transmitted it to Earth with a personal note, expressing my hope that these improved terms would address whatever concerns had motivated their previous refusals. The human response arrived in 9 hours. They thanked the Council for its generosity. They noted that the enhanced terms were remarkable and demonstrated the Council's commitment to interspecies cooperation, and they declined. The 5th refusal landed in the rotunda, like a physical blow. I watched delegates who had governed vast stellar territories for centuries react with something I had never seen in the Council chambers before. They were confused. Not the productive confusion that leads to new strategies, but the bewildered, disoriented confusion of beings confronting something that did not fit into any category they possessed. Delegate Morith of the Velthari Communion rose next. The Velthari were an ancient species, deeply spiritual, who believed that every civilization's trajectory was guided by a form of cosmic intentionality. Morith's theory was more unsettling than Saythorn's mercantile explanation. She proposed that the humans had developed FTL capability in secret and were refusing the Council's offer because they did not need it. If true, this meant a Tier 9 civilization had achieved faster-than-light travel independently, something that had not happened in over 6,000 years. More importantly, it meant they had hidden this achievement from the Council's survey probes, which implied a level of technological sophistication and strategic deception that was deeply alarming. I told Delegate Morith that our probes had conducted thorough scans of the human system and found no evidence of FTL technology. She responded that the absence of evidence was not evidence of absence, which earned her approving murmurs from several delegations. The Council authorized a covert sensor sweep of the human system. I objected, noting that if the humans detected the sweep, it would undermine whatever trust remained between our civilizations. My objection was noted and overruled. The sweep was conducted by Ekral swarm reconnaissance vessels, the most advanced stealth technology in the Council's arsenal. It found nothing. No hidden FTL drives, no concealed weapons platforms, no secret fleet. Just a species sitting on a single planet, burning hydrocarbons, arguing among themselves, and refusing to join the most powerful political body in the galaxy. This finding did not calm the Council. If anything, it made the panic worse. Because if the humans were not negotiating for better terms and were not secretly advanced, then there was no rational explanation for their behavior. And a species whose behavior defied rational analysis was, in the Council's experience, far more dangerous than one with hidden weapons. The offers continued, each one more extravagant than the last. The 6th package included a permanent seat on the Council's Security Advisory Board. The 7th offered to relocate Earth's entire population to a larger, more resource-rich world if they desired. The 8th included a formal apology for the unannounced sensor sweep, which the humans had indeed detected and responded to with a pointed message about respecting boundaries. Every offer was declined, the same polite language, the same courteous tone, the same firm, absolute, immovable no. I stopped counting after the 10th refusal. The council did not. They had established a dedicated task force to manage what they were now calling the human question, a name that carried uncomfortable echoes of similar phrases from humanity's own history, though the council did not know that yet. The task force met daily. It had its own budget, its own staff, its own secure communication channels. It produced reports with titles like Psychological Profile of Human Decision-Making and Risk Assessment, Prolonged Non-Integration Scenarios. I read every one of them. They were thorough, well-researched, and completely wrong, because every single one of them started from the assumption that the humans must have a hidden reason for refusing, some secret agenda that could be identified, addressed, and neutralized. None of them considered the possibility that the humans had already stated their reason openly and honestly, and that the council simply could not hear it, because it was a reason the council had no framework to understand. During this period, I continued my personal study of human civilization. I had moved beyond their political history and into their philosophical traditions, their economic theories, their approach to interpersonal relationships, and I found something that stopped me cold. A concept so fundamental to human thought that it permeated every level of their civilization, yet so alien to galactic diplomatic practice that no species in the council had ever articulated it. Leverage. Not leverage in the simple sense of having something your opponent wants. Every species understood that. I mean leverage as a governing philosophy. The humans had built their entire approach to negotiation around a single principle. The party willing to walk away holds the power. They had codified this principle. They taught it in their educational institutions. They wrote books about it. Their most successful leaders, their most effective negotiators, their most prosperous merchants, all of them operated from this foundation. And they were applying it to us. The council had always assumed that the offer itself was the leverage. We had the technology. We had the protection. We had the stars. What could a Tier 9 species possibly have that would give them leverage over the Galactic Council? The answer was breathtaking in its simplicity. They had the ability to say no. And in a system where no one had ever said no, that single word carried more power than any fleet or any technology the council possessed. I tried to explain this to the task force. I was met with blank stares and polite dismissal. The concept was too simple. It could not possibly be the explanation. There had to be something else, some hidden agenda, some secret strategy that we were not seeing. But there was nothing hidden. That was the entire point. The humans were not playing a complicated game. They were doing something far more radical. They were refusing to play at all. The breaking point came during the 12th offer. The council had authorized me to conduct the presentation via holographic summit, a face-to-face meeting conducted through real-time projection technology that would allow me to speak directly with the human delegation. It was the first time any council representative had interacted with humans in real time. Previous communications had all been conducted through formal transmissions. The summit was held in a facility the humans had prepared in one of their coastal cities. I projected into a simple room with white walls and a long table. The human delegation was small, 5 individuals in plain clothing. No uniforms, no ceremonial garments, no displays of rank or authority. They sat at the table with notebooks and water glasses and watched me materialize with expressions of polite interest. I presented the 12th offer. It was, by far, the most generous package the council had ever assembled for any species. I spoke for 40 minutes, detailing every benefit, every protection, every technological marvel that would transform their civilization. I was thorough. I was persuasive. I used every technique I had refined over 3 decades of diplomatic service. When I finished, the delegation did not immediately respond. They looked at each other. A woman at the center of the group, whose name I would later learn was Cora Vasquez, made a small notation in her notebook. Then she looked directly at my projected form and asked a single question. Ambassador Sonori, we have read the Unification Compact in its entirety. We have a question regarding Section 14, Subclause 71.4. Could you explain the Council's authority over member species reproductive policy, and could you clarify whether that authority has ever been exercised? The room went very quiet. Not just the room on Earth. The observation chamber aboard my diplomatic cruiser, where 17 council analysts were monitoring the summit, went silent as well. I could feel their attention like a physical weight. I had read subclause 71.4 during my private review of the compact weeks earlier. It granted the council oversight authority over member species population growth rates, with the power to mandate adjustments if a species expansion was deemed to threaten regional stability. It had been exercised twice in the council's history, both times against species that had exceeded their allocated territorial boundaries. The measures imposed had been described as voluntary adjustments in official records, though the word voluntary was doing considerable heavy lifting in that description. I answered Cora's question as honestly as I could within the bounds of my diplomatic obligations. I confirmed the clause existed. I explained its intended purpose. I acknowledged that it had been applied in limited circumstances. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she nodded slowly, and then asked a follow-up that I had not anticipated. Could you tell us which other clauses in the compact authorize the Council to override the sovereign decisions of member species? And could you confirm whether there is a mechanism for a member species to withdraw from the compact if they disagree with such decisions? I opened my mouth. I closed it. I looked at the 17 analysts in my observation chamber, all of whom were suddenly very interested in their own consoles. I looked back at Cora Vasquez, sitting in her plain clothing at her simple table with her notebook and her water glass, and I understood with absolute clarity that this woman had read the entire Unification Compact, all 900 pages of it, and she had understood it better than I did. I told her that the compact did not contain a formal withdrawal mechanism. I told her that one had never been necessary. I told her that the Council was a community of mutual benefit, and that no species had ever expressed a desire to leave. She wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked up and said, very quietly, "Ambassador, we appreciate the Council's generosity, but we have concluded that the terms of the Unification Compact are not compatible with our principles of self-determination. We decline." The summit ended. I stood in my observation chamber while the holographic projectors powered down. The analysts avoided my eyes. Nobody spoke for a very long time. I wrote my report that night. I was blunt. I said that the humans were not primitive. I said they were not confused. I said they had identified structural problems in the compact that the Council had never been forced to confront because no species had ever thought to look. I said that continuing to offer the same terms with increasing generosity would not change the outcome, because the humans' objection was not about the terms, it was about the framework. I sent the report through classified channels. It was received, it was read, and within 72 hours, the Council had convened another emergency session to authorize a response that would prove everything I had warned them about. Because while I had been trying to understand the humans, Kravith of the Ikral swarm had been doing something far less diplomatic. He had been repositioning fleets. And the Council, gripped by a panic that had now metastasized into something darker than confusion, had decided that if humanity would not accept the galaxy's open hand, perhaps they needed to see its closed fist. I landed on Earth 48 hours before the Ikral fleet was scheduled to arrive in their system. The Council had not told me about the fleet. They had told me I was being deployed to the surface as part of a cultural immersion initiative designed to gather intelligence that might inform a new diplomatic approach. This was technically true in the same way that a predator circling its prey is technically going for a walk. I found out about the fleet from a junior analyst named Pell, who owed me a favor and whose security clearance was slightly too high for his ability to keep secrets. He pulled me aside during my pre-deployment briefing and told me, in a whisper, that Kravith had received authorization to deploy the 5th Enforcement Fleet to Earth's orbit. 400 warships, the same fleet that had brought the Voron into compliance after their border dispute. The same fleet the Drelkathi had surrendered to without a single weapons discharge. I asked Pell what the deployment's objective was. He said the official order used the phrase, "persuasive demonstration of collective security capability." I asked him what that meant in plain language. He said it meant they were going to park 400 warships over a planet of 8 billion people and wait for them to reconsider their position. I considered refusing the deployment for approximately 4 seconds. Then I boarded the transport because I realized that if I was going to be any use to anyone, I needed to be on the ground when the fleet arrived, Not because I thought I could stop what was coming, but because someone needed to witness it. My transport entered Earth's atmosphere over the southern Pacific Ocean. The descent was unremarkable from a technical standpoint, but overwhelming from every other perspective. I had seen hundreds of worlds from orbit. I had walked on surfaces shaped by geological forces I could name and categorize. But Earth was different. Earth was chaotic. The cloud patterns were asymmetric and unpredictable. The land masses were scattered across the surface without any of the tidy continental arrangements I was accustomed to. Even the color was wrong, a blue so deep and so vivid that it looked almost artificial, broken by swirls of white and patches of green and brown that shifted and blended without any apparent order. I was met at the landing site by a security detail and a woman who extended her hand toward me in what I recognized from my research as a greeting gesture. She was shorter than I expected, with dark hair pulled back from her face and eyes that were simultaneously warm and evaluating. She introduced herself as Cora Vasquez, Senior Liaison for Interstellar Affairs, which I later learned was a title that had been created approximately 3 weeks earlier, because nobody on Earth had previously needed one. Ambassador Sonori, she said, I watched your holographic summit. You were the most honest person on the Council's side of that call. That is why I requested you, specifically for this visit. I asked her how she had managed to request a specific Council diplomat. She smiled and said, We asked. It turns out your people are not accustomed to being asked things. They tend to say yes out of sheer surprise. That exchange set the tone for everything that followed. I had expected to be taken to a secure government facility. Instead, Cora drove me through the streets of the city in a personal vehicle, narrating as she went. She pointed out buildings and monuments. She described their history. She told me about the people who lived here, what they did, what they cared about, what they fought over. She was not performing. She was not trying to impress me with human achievements, or intimidate me with human capability. She was simply showing me who they were. And who they were was complicated. The city was a collision of order and disorder. Ancient structures stood beside modern ones. Wealthy neighborhoods bordered impoverished ones, with no buffer between them. Markets overflowed with goods produced on 6 continents, sold by vendors who shouted prices in 3 languages, and negotiated with a ferocity that would have startled veteran galactic trade brokers. Children ran through public parks while their parents argued about politics on portable communication devices. A street musician played an instrument I could not name, beside a monument to a war I did not understand, and people walked past both, without slowing down, because this was ordinary to them. All of it was ordinary. People moved through the streets with a frenetic energy that made the Council's most bustling trade stations look sedated by comparison. Everyone seemed to be arguing, on street corners, in vehicles, into communication devices pressed against their ears. Arguing about politics, about sports, about the price of food, about where to eat dinner, about the existence of extraterrestrial life, while an actual extraterrestrial was sitting in the vehicle next to them. You find this chaotic, Cora observed, watching my reaction. I told her that I found it energetic. She laughed. That is a diplomatic way of saying chaotic. It is all right. We find ourselves chaotic too. That is sort of the point. I asked her what she meant. I mean that we have never had a single authority that speaks for all of us. We have never had one government, one philosophy, one way of organizing ourselves. We have spent our entire history arguing about the best way to do things, and we have never reached consensus. Some people think that makes us weak, fractured, but it also means that no single person, no single institution, can make a decision that commits all of us without the rest of us having the opportunity to object. She glanced at me. Your council has a single authority, one compact, one set of rules for everyone, and everyone signed it. But Ambassador, did everyone read it? That question landed like a blow to my chest. She took me to a building that served as the temporary headquarters for Earth's interstellar affairs operation. It was a converted office complex, hastily adapted for its new purpose. There were no grand halls, no ceremonial chambers, no imposing architecture designed to project power. There were desks and computers and whiteboards covered in handwritten notes, and people moving between rooms with folders and coffee cups and expressions of focused determination. Cora introduced me to her team, a constitutional scholar named Henry Dalton, who had spent the past 6 weeks analyzing the Unification Compact through the lens of Earth's legal traditions, a historian named Sophie Price, who had compiled a comprehensive study of every integration the Council had ever conducted, working from publicly available Council records that, she told me with a raised eyebrow, the Council apparently never expected anyone to actually read. An economist named George Harland, who had modeled the long-term financial implications of compact membership and concluded that the technology licensing structure was designed to create dependency, not independence. And a communications specialist named Claire Beckett, who had been monitoring Council diplomatic frequencies, and who, when I met her, was in the process of decrypting a transmission that she probably should not have been able to decrypt. I spent 3 days with this team. They were not what I expected. They were not hostile to the Council. They were not driven by xenophobia or isolationism or fear. They were curious. They asked me thousands of questions about galactic civilization, about the species I had worked with, about the cultures and technologies and histories of the wider universe. They listened to my answers with genuine interest and genuine respect. But they also showed me things. Henry walked me through the compact clause by clause, and with each clause he cited a parallel from human history. The technology licensing structure that ensured member species could never manufacture their own FTL drives, only use Council-issued ones that could be remotely deactivated. He compared it to an economic practice from their colonial era, where powerful nations had provided tools and infrastructure to less powerful ones, but retained ownership and control, creating a permanent relationship of dependence. The military protection clause that gave the Council sole authority over when and how a member species could deploy armed forces, even in self-defense. Sophie found 3 historical examples of similar arrangements from human history, and in every case, the protected party had eventually been compelled to act against its own interests to serve the strategic objectives of the protector. The reproductive oversight provision, buried in subclause 71.4, George calculated that based on the Council's population growth algorithms, humanity would be flagged for mandatory population adjustment within 40 years of membership, given their current growth rate. And the withdrawal clause, or rather, the absence of one. Claire pulled up Council records, showing that 2 species had attempted to raise the question of withdrawal over the past 4,000 years. Both times, the inquiry had been classified and sealed. Both species had subsequently experienced what the Council records described as internal restructuring events that resulted in new, more cooperative governments. Claire did not editorialize on these findings. She did not need to. The facts spoke with a voice that was louder than any commentary. Henry showed me one more thing before I left his office that day. He had compiled a timeline of every technology the Council had provided to member species, and beside each entry, he had noted whether the receiving species had ever been able to replicate that technology independently. In 11,000 years, covering over 4,000 species, not a single member had ever manufactured its own FTL drive, not one. They all used Council-issued hardware, and every Council-issued FTL drive contained a component that, when activated by a remote signal from the Council's central command, would render the drive permanently inoperable. Your Council calls this a safety feature, Henry said, adjusting his glasses. In our history, we call it a kill switch. I sat in that converted office building and felt the foundations of my career shift beneath me. I was not angry at the humans. I was not even angry at the Council. I was angry at myself. I had carried the accession package to dozens of species. I had smiled and spoken of partnership and mutual benefit. And I had never once read the document I was asking them to sign with the same scrutiny that a team of humans with no galactic experience had applied in 6 weeks. On my 3rd night on Earth, Cora found me on the building's rooftop, staring at the sky. She stood beside me without speaking for several minutes. The city sprawled below us, alive with light and noise, and the endless kinetic energy of 8 billion people living their complicated, argumentative, beautiful lives. You are wondering why we read it so carefully, she said. I told her that I was wondering why nobody else had. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Let me tell you about a concept from our history. We call it the treaty." For most of our civilization's existence, when a powerful group encountered a less powerful group, they offered a treaty, protection, trade, access to resources. The terms always sounded generous. They were designed to sound generous. But buried in the details, in the subclauses and the fine print, were provisions that transferred power from the weaker party to the stronger one. Land rights, resource extraction, military obligations, governance oversight. The weaker party signed because the offer seemed too good to refuse, and because refusing carried the implicit threat of force. She turned to look at me. Ambassador, my species has been on both sides of that table. We have been the powerful group offering generous terms that concealed hidden costs. And we have been the weaker group, desperate enough to sign without reading. We know what both positions feel like. And we have spent centuries building institutions designed to prevent exactly the kind of arrangement your council is offering us. Your offer is generous, she continued. It is genuinely generous. There are things in that package that could transform our world. But we have learned, through painful experience, that generosity with conditions is not generosity, it is investment. And investors expect returns. I asked her what she thought the council's expected return was. Compliance, she said simply. The same thing every powerful institution wants from those it absorbs. Not resources, not territory. Compliance. A species that follows the rules, fills its role, and never asks what happens when the rules stop serving them. I stood on that rooftop and thought about the 400 warships that were, at that moment, crossing the void toward this world. I thought about the species I had integrated over 3 decades. All of them now bound by a document they had never questioned. I thought about the 2 species that had questioned it, and the sealed files that recorded what happened next. And I thought about Cora Vasquez, standing on a rooftop in the dark, perfectly aware that she was talking to a representative of the organization that was about to threaten her entire species, and doing so with a calm that I now recognized not as naivety, but as the quiet resolve of someone who had already calculated the risks and decided that some things mattered more than safety. Your species has no FTL capability, I said. You have no shields. You have nuclear weapons pointed at each other. You are refusing the greatest offer any civilization has ever received because of subclauses. Cora's response was immediate and delivered without a trace of hesitation. Ambassador, my species wrote the book on burying control in subclauses. That is exactly why we recognize it when someone else does it. The next morning, I sent a classified report to the council through a secure channel. I used the strongest language my diplomatic training would allow. I recommended, in terms that left no room for ambiguity, that the council not attempt to pressure, threaten, or coerce this species. I stated that the humans were not refusing out of ignorance or stubbornness or strategic calculation. They were refusing because they had identified fundamental structural problems in the compact that the council had never been forced to address, and because their entire civilization had been shaped by a history that made them uniquely equipped to recognize coercive agreements disguised as generous ones. I concluded my report with a single recommendation: engage with humanity on their terms, or not at all. But do not, under any circumstances, attempt to force compliance. Because this was a species that had spent its entire existence fighting against exactly that kind of pressure, and they had survived every attempt. My report was received by the Council's Intelligence Division. It was flagged as classified. It was reviewed by the appropriate authorities. And then, precisely as I had feared, it was buried. 12 hours later, Claire burst into my quarters with a tablet showing intercepted sensor data. 400 ICRAL warships had dropped out of FTL at the edge of the human system and were advancing toward Earth in full combat formation. I looked at Claire. She looked at me. And then she said something that I would remember for the rest of my life. We knew they were coming, Ambassador. We have known for 6 days. I asked her how. She told me that their communication specialist team had been monitoring ICRAL fleet movement patterns since the covert sensor sweep, and that while they could not decrypt the ICRAL's tactical channels, they could read the subspace wake signatures that 400 warships left when they initiated FTL travel. I asked her what they planned to do. She smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who had been preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. and who had just learned that the worst was exactly what they were going to get. "Something no one expects," she said. "We are going to talk." The fleet arrived on a Tuesday. I know this because Cora mentioned it as she walked past my quarters that morning, and I asked her why the specific day mattered. She said it did not matter at all, which was precisely the point. The most powerful military force the galaxy had ever assembled was about to take position over her planet, and she was noting the day of the week as if scheduling a dentist appointment. That composure was not an act. I had spent enough time among humans by then to recognize the difference between performed calm and genuine resolve. Cora was afraid. Everyone in the building was afraid. I could see it in the way they moved, the tightness in their shoulders, the slight tremor in hands that gripped coffee cups too hard. But fear was not the same as panic, and panic was not the same as surrender. These people were afraid the way a person is afraid before jumping from a great height into water they know is deep enough. The fear was real, but the decision had already been made. I watched the fleet's arrival from the roof of the liaison building, using a portable display that Claire had configured to show real-time sensor data from Earth's orbital monitoring stations. 400 warships materialized in a staggered formation that filled a volume of space roughly twice the size of Earth's moon. The Ikral Swarm's 5th Enforcement Fleet. Dreadnoughts, cruisers, interceptor carriers, and support vessels, arranged in the signature spiral pattern that the Ikral used when they wanted to project overwhelming force without technically assuming an attack posture. It was a formation designed to terrify. I had seen it deployed against the Voron during their border dispute, and the Voron, a species with a functioning space navy and 3 centuries of council membership, had capitulated within hours. The Drelkathi had surrendered at the sight of it. Even the Kelthar Dominion, widely regarded as one of the most martially capable species in the galaxy, had agreed to negotiations after the Fifth Fleet had positioned itself above their homeworld for 6 days. Earth did not capitulate. Earth did not surrender. Earth did not agree to negotiations. Earth went silent. For 6 hours, no transmission left the planet. No response to hails. No acknowledgement of the fleet's presence. No frantic diplomatic communications. Nothing. The Ikral commanders, accustomed to immediate reactions from species confronted with their fleet, were unsettled. I could tell because they began cycling through their standard intimidation protocols, activating targeting sensors, launching fighter patrols, running their weapon systems through visible power-up sequences, all designed to provoke a response. Nothing. I found Cora in a basement conference room, surrounded by her team, and approximately 40 other people I had not seen before. Some wore military uniforms, some wore civilian clothing. All of them were focused on screens and documents with an intensity that bordered on religious devotion. "Cora," I said, "there are 400 warships above your planet." "I know," she said, without looking up from her screen. "Your species has no space-based defenses. You cannot fight them." "I know that too." "Then what are you doing?" She looked up at me then, and her expression held something I had not seen before. Not fear, not anger, certainty. The expression of someone who was about to play the only card they had, and who knew it was the right one. "We are about to do something that has never been done in the history of your council," she said. "We are going to tell the truth." Cora explained what was about to happen with the brisk efficiency of someone who had been planning for this moment since the first Ikral ship had been detected 6 days ago. Her team had spent those 6 days on a single project. They had taken the entire Unification Compact, all 900 pages of it, and they had translated it. Not into human languages. They had done that weeks ago. They had translated it into 34 galactic languages, every major language spoken by every significant member species in the Council. But they had not merely translated it, they had annotated it. Every clause that transferred authority from member species to the Council had been highlighted and cross-referenced with the specific historical examples of how that authority had been exercised. Every provision that created dependency had been identified and explained. Every missing safeguard, every absent right, every mechanism of control that was built into the document structure had been laid bare in clear, simple language that any species could understand. "Your council has relied on one thing for 11,000 years, Cora said. The assumption that nobody reads the fine print. Every species that joined was so grateful, so overwhelmed, so eager for the technology and the protection, that they signed without understanding what they were giving up, and once they signed, they never went back and read it. Because by then, they were inside the system, and the system does not encourage questions. She turned her screen toward me. On it was a broadcast interface connected to a communications array that I recognized as military-grade hardware. 6 days ago, when we detected the fleet, Claire's team did something remarkable. They identified a vulnerability in the Ikral swarm's communication relay system. The Ikral use a distributed network of subspace repeaters to maintain contact with the Council and with each other across interstellar distances. Those repeaters are accessible by every Council member species. They are, in effect, the galactic internet. Claire's team, Cora continued, has figured out how to broadcast on that network. I stared at her. You cannot broadcast on the Council's communication network. You are not a member species. You do not have authorization. We do not have authorization, Cora agreed. But we have the access codes. Your encryption is very good, Ambassador. But it was designed to keep out species with equivalent or superior technology. It was not designed to keep out a species that has spent its entire history breaking codes, because we keep making enemies of each other. She stood up. Around her, the room was moving with coordinated purpose. Technicians were running final checks on equipment. Claire was at a console, her fingers moving across controls with the focused precision of someone about to do something that could not be undone. In approximately 10 minutes, Cora said, we are going to broadcast a live transmission on every Council communication channel simultaneously. Every species in the galaxy with a receiver will see it. And what they will see is the truth about the document they all signed. I asked her if she understood the consequences. She said she did. I asked her if she understood that the Ikral fleet above her planet might interpret an unauthorized broadcast as a hostile act. She said she understood that too. I asked her if she had a contingency plan in case the fleet responded with force before the broadcast could finish. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, our contingency plan is to speak fast. It was not a joke. Or perhaps it was, in the way that humans sometimes use humor to acknowledge a fear they have already decided to walk through, rather than around. Ambassador, she said, your fleet came here to frighten us into signing a document that would strip us of our sovereignty, our autonomy, and our right to determine our own future. We cannot fight 400 warships. We do not have the technology. We do not have the weapons. But we have something your Council has spent 11,000 years making sure no one else has. We have the information, and we are about to share it. The broadcast began at 1400 hours, local time. Cora Vasquez stood at a simple podium in the basement conference room. Behind her, a screen displayed the first page of the Unification Compact. She wore the same plain clothing she had worn every day I had known her. No uniform, no ceremonial dress, no symbols of authority. She was a mid-level government official from a species that had not yet left its own solar system, and she was about to address the entire galaxy. She began speaking, and her voice carried the steady cadence of someone who had rehearsed not the words, but the resolve behind them. To every species receiving this transmission, my name is Cora Vasquez. I am speaking to you from the surface of Earth, the homeworld of humanity. Above our planet, 400 warships of the Ikral Swarm's 5th Enforcement Fleet are currently positioned in combat formation. They are here because we refuse to sign the Galactic Council's Unification Compact. We refused not once, but 12 times, and we are about to tell you why. The screen behind her advanced to the first highlighted section, and then, with a clarity and a patience that would have done credit to any professor at any university, on any world, Cora Vasquez began to read the Unification Compact to the galaxy. Not all of it. That would have taken days. She read the sections that mattered. The technology licensing provisions that ensured no member species could ever develop independent FTL capability. The military oversight clauses that stripped member species of the right to self-defense without Council authorization. The economic frameworks that channeled trade through Council-controlled corridors, ensuring that no member species could build independent commercial relationships. The Population Oversight Authority, buried in Subclause 71.4. And the complete absence of any withdrawal mechanism. She read each section in its original galactic legal language. Then she explained it in plain terms. Then she showed the historical precedents, the cases where these provisions had been enforced, drawn from the Council's own records. The broadcast lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. During that time, I stood in the corner of the room and watched the galaxy change. The first sign was the Ikral fleet. 90 minutes into the broadcast, their formation began to shift. Not aggressively. The ships were repositioning, and at first, I thought they were preparing for an attack. Then I realized what was happening. Individual ships were breaking formation. Not all of them, but enough. Ships crewed by species who were, at that very moment, receiving a broadcast that told them, for the first time, what they had agreed to when they joined the Council. The Ikral Swarm's Fifth Fleet was not a single species force. Like most Council military formations, it drew personnel and vessels from dozens of member species. And those species were now watching a human woman read them the contract they had signed centuries ago. Claire's monitoring station began lighting up with incoming transmissions. Not to Earth, to the Council. Formal protests filed by species demanding clarification of compact provisions they had never been aware of. Emergency sessions convened by planetary governments. Media inquiries from species whose independent press had picked up the broadcast and were running it live. And then the withdrawals started. The first came from the Pelori Collective, a species that had been a council member for over 2,000 years. Their transmission was brief. They were suspending their participation in the council, pending a full legal review of the compact's terms. The second came from the Yareth Federation, citing the broadcast's revelation about Subclause 71.4. The third came from the Noth Alliance, who stated simply that they had never been informed of the military oversight provisions and considered their membership void on grounds of inadequate disclosure. By the time Cora finished her broadcast, 12 species had filed formal suspension notices, 3 more had announced reviews, and the Ikral fleet above Earth had lost 67 ships, withdrawn by the governments of species that no longer considered themselves bound by Council authority. The remaining ships hung in their positions like teeth missing from a jaw, and the gaps told a story that no amount of firepower could contradict. The fleet that had come to demonstrate unity was now the most visible proof in the galaxy that unity, when built on concealment, could not survive the truth. On the Council's homeworld, the Grand Rotunda had descended into something that longtime observers would later describe as unprecedented. Delegates were not debating, they were shouting. Species that had sat beside each other in polite cooperation for centuries were now demanding explanations from the Council's legal division. The legal division, confronted with questions it had never prepared for, responded with the only tool it had left: procedural delay. They announced a formal review process that would take an estimated 18 months. The Pelori delegate responded by reading Subclause 71.4 aloud on the rotunda floor and asking the legal division to explain it in plain language. They could not. I found Cora after the broadcast. She was sitting in a chair in the hallway outside the conference room, drinking water from a paper cup. Her hands were shaking. The composure that had carried her through 2 hours of addressing the galaxy had finally cracked, and she looked exactly like what she was, a person who had just done the most frightening thing of her life and was only now allowing herself to feel it. I sat down beside her. We did not speak for a long time. Finally I said, "Was this always the plan? Refuse every offer until they sent the fleet, so you would have the galaxy's attention?" She took a long breath. "We did not refuse the offers to be stubborn, Ambassador. We refused them because they were wrong. We just needed everyone else to see it too." "And the fleet?" She looked at me with tired eyes. "We hoped they would not send it. We planned for the possibility that they would. And yes, we understood that 400 warships in our sky would guarantee that every species in the galaxy would be watching when we finally explained why we said no." I asked her if she had considered what would happen if the fleet had opened fire before the broadcast. She nodded. "Every day for 6 days, every hour, I considered it. And I decided that a species that would rather die telling the truth than live under terms that strip them of who they are is a species worth being." The Ikral fleet withdrew the following morning, not on Council orders. The Council was in no condition to issue orders. The fleet withdrew, because there was no longer a unified command structure to hold it together. The ships that remained were crewed by species still loyal to the existing compact, but they were outnumbered by the absences, and a fleet with gaps in its formation is not a fleet projecting strength. It is a fleet advertising its fractures. Kravith, the Ikral commander, sent one final transmission before the fleet departed. It was addressed to me, not to the humans. It said simply, "You were right." I did not know how to respond to that, so I did not respond at all. I am writing this from an office on the 43rd floor of a building in the city where I first landed on Earth. Through the window, I can see a skyline that has changed in the 12 months since the broadcast, not physically. The buildings are the same, but there are new antennas on the rooftops now, part of the interstellar communication network that humanity has been building with the cooperation of 14 species that left the old council and formed a working group with Earth at its center. It is not an alliance. The humans are very careful about that word. It is a working group, a collaborative framework for renegotiating the terms of interstellar cooperation from the ground up. And the first principle of that framework, the one that Cora Vasquez insisted on before anything else was discussed, is that any species may leave at any time, for any reason, and take everything that belongs to them when they go. The old council still exists. It has not collapsed. Some predicted it would, in those chaotic weeks after the broadcast, when emergency sessions ran around the clock and delegates who had governed with serene confidence for millennia found themselves answering questions they had never been asked before. But institutions that have existed for 11,000 years do not collapse easily. They adapt, or they calcify, and the council is in the process of deciding which path it will take. 41 species have formally suspended their participation in the old compact, pending renegotiation. 14 have fully withdrawn and joined the working group. The remainder are watching, waiting, calculating. Many of them are reading the compact, truly reading it, for the first time. Some of them are discovering the same things that Sophie Price and Henry Dalton found in those early weeks, and they are not pleased. The Ikral swarm has undergone what their press releases describe as a strategic realignment. In practical terms, this means that Kravith was quietly reassigned to a logistics position in a remote sector, and the 5th Enforcement Fleet was disbanded. Not because the Ikral believe in reform, but because a fleet that fractured in full view of the galaxy is not a useful instrument of intimidation. The threat only works if everyone believes it is unified, and that belief died the day 67 ships broke formation over Earth. I attend the working group sessions as an independent observer. This is a polite way of saying that my own government fired me 3 months after the broadcast. Not publicly. They did not announce it or explain it. My access credentials simply stopped working one morning, and when I attempted to contact my supervisor, I was informed that my position had been restructured. The Velthari Communion, my home species, was one of the original council members, and they are not among the 41 that have suspended participation. They remain committed to the existing compact, though I notice their delegates have become considerably more careful about which questions they answer in public sessions. I do not regret what happened. I could not have stopped it even if I wanted to. The humans did not need my permission or my assistance to do what they did. They simply needed time, and the council, in its arrogance, gave them plenty of it. Every rejected offer, every repeated attempt, every month of diplomatic back and forth gave Cora's team more time to analyze, to prepare, and to build the communication infrastructure that made the broadcast possible. The working group meetings are held in a converted convention center in the same city where the broadcast originated. The humans insisted on hosting, partly for practical reasons, and partly, I suspect, because they wanted the galaxy to see what their civilization actually looked like. Not the statistics from survey probes, not the clinical assessments in council integration files. The real thing, the noise and the mess and the arguments and the coffee, and the people who cannot agree on anything except the things that matter most. I observed the first session of compact renegotiation with a mixture of professional interest and personal wonder. Cora led the human delegation, which had grown from 5 people in a basement to a team of 47, drawn from 31 nations. They did not agree on everything. They argued about procedure. They debated formatting. They spent an entire afternoon on the question of whether the new document should use numbered sections or lettered paragraphs, a debate so passionate that two delegates from the same country threatened to submit competing proposals. But when it came to substance, when it came to the principles that would form the foundation of the new framework, they spoke with a unity that startled the galactic delegates. Every clause they proposed was built on the same core concept. Consent must be informed, ongoing, and revocable. No species should be bound by terms it did not understand. No species should be prevented from leaving. No technology should be licensed in a way that creates dependency. No military arrangement should strip a species of the right to defend itself. These were not radical ideas. On Earth, they were considered so basic that most humans took them for granted. But in the context of galactic governance, they were revolutionary. For 11,000 years, the Council had operated on the assumption that membership was permanent, and authority flowed from the center outward. The idea that authority might flow from the members upward, that the governing body might exist to serve its members rather than the other way around, was genuinely new. Not all species embraced it. The Drayan hegemony, whose commercial interests were deeply entangled with the Council's trade corridor system, opposed virtually every reform. They argued that the existing compact had produced stability, prosperity, and peace for millennia, and that destabilizing it, based on the objections of a single pre-FTL species, was reckless. They were not entirely wrong. The old system had produced stability. The question was what that stability had cost, and who had paid the price. The Pelori Collective, among the first to suspend their membership, became one of the most vocal advocates for reform. Their delegate, a thoughtful individual named Saren, told me during a break in the proceedings that her species had spent 2,000 years as council members and had never once questioned the compact. When she watched the broadcast and learned about Subclause 71.4, she had initially refused to believe it. She had pulled up the original document and read it herself, and the clause was exactly where the humans said it was, exactly as restrictive as they described. "We signed it," Saren said to me, her voice carrying a weight that had nothing to do with volume. 2,000 years ago, my ancestors signed it because they were being offered the stars, and no one in all that time ever went back and asked what we gave up in exchange. She paused. "The humans did not give us new information, Ambassador. They gave us the information we already had. They just made us read it." That observation stayed with me. Cora offered me a position 3 months into the working group's proceedings, Director of Interspecies Relations for Earth's newly established Interstellar Affairs Office. The title was grander than the reality, which involved a small staff, a modest budget, and the unenviable task of helping a species with no galactic experience navigate the complexities of interstellar diplomacy. I accepted without hesitation, not because I had no other options, though my options were limited given that my own government had effectively disowned me. I accepted because I believed in what the humans were building, and because I had spent 31 years carrying the accession package to species across the galaxy, and I wanted to spend whatever years I had left helping to write something better. The work is difficult. The humans are not easy partners. They argue constantly. They second-guess decisions. They form committees to review the recommendations of other committees. Their decision-making process is so distributed and so contentious that achieving consensus on even minor procedural matters can take weeks. But they also do something that no galactic species I have ever encountered does. They change their minds. When presented with new information, with a compelling argument, with evidence that contradicts their position, they reconsider. Not always quickly, not always gracefully, but they do it. They built their entire civilization on the principle that no idea is too important to question, and no authority is too powerful to challenge, and they apply that principle with a consistency that is as exhausting as it is admirable. I attended a session last week where the working group was drafting the technology sharing provisions of the new framework. The old compact had licensed technology to member species, retaining council control over critical systems like FTL drives. The humans proposed an alternative: full, unrestricted technology transfer. If a species joins the new framework, they receive the complete specifications for every technology shared within the group. No licensing, no remote deactivation, no dependency. Several galactic delegates objected. What if a species used the technology irresponsibly? What if they weaponized it? What if they built a fleet and attacked their neighbors? These were legitimate concerns, and the humans acknowledged them. Then George Harland, the economist who had first analyzed the compact's dependency structures, stood up and said something that I wrote down because I wanted to remember it exactly. If a species is going to misuse technology, they will find a way to do so regardless of licensing restrictions. The only thing licensing does is ensure that the species that follows the rules is permanently dependent on the species that made them. We propose trust, and if trust is betrayed, we deal with the consequences together, as equals, not as a governing body and its subjects. The room was quiet after he spoke. Not the stunned silence that followed humanity's first refusal. A thoughtful silence, the silence of beings genuinely considering a new idea. The Drayan delegate raised an objection. He said that trust was a naive foundation for interstellar policy. George did not argue with him. Instead, he pulled up data showing that in 11,000 years of the old compact's licensing model, 16 species had still managed to weaponize restricted technology. The licensing had not prevented misuse. It had only ensured that the species who followed the rules remained dependent, while the species who broke them faced no greater consequence than they would have faced under an open system. The licensing did not create safety. It created an illusion of safety, and the illusion benefited only the species that controlled the licenses. The Drayan delegate did not respond immediately. He sat with the data in front of him and stared at it for a long time. When the session adjourned, he was still sitting there. The working group voted to adopt the human proposal, with modifications suggested by the Pelori and the Yareth. It was not perfect. Nothing produced by a collaborative process involving 14 species and 47 opinionated humans is perfect. But it was honest, and it was built on a foundation that the old compact never had. The understanding that any participant could walk away at any time, which meant that every participant who stayed was choosing to be there. Cora handed me my credentials on a Thursday afternoon. A small identification card with my name and title printed in English and in my native script. She shook my hand in the human greeting gesture and said, "Welcome to the team, Yathal. Fair warning, we argue about everything." I looked at the card. I looked at the city outside the window, alive with its beautiful chaos. I looked at the woman who had stood in a basement and talked the galaxy into questioning everything it had accepted for 11,000 years. "After watching your species argue its way into rewriting galactic law," I told her, "I consider that a feature, not a flaw." She laughed. It was the first time I had heard her laugh without reservation, without the weight of the fleet above her planet, or the burden of the broadcast ahead of her. It was just laughter, simple and human and free. They ask me sometimes, the old council delegates, the ones who are still bitter about what happened, the ones who view the working group as a disruption and humanity as a nuisance. They ask me why I defected to the human side, why I abandoned 31 years of service to the Council, why I chose a species that had no fleet, no FTL drives, and no galactic experience over the most powerful political institution the universe had ever produced. I tell them I did not defect. I tell them I simply read the fine print. And for the first time in 11,000 years, so did everyone else. Some of them understand, most of them do not, but the ones who go home and pull up the compact and start reading, really reading, the way a team of humans in a basement taught the galaxy to read, those are the ones who call me back weeks later, with quiet voices and uncomfortable questions. And I answer every question, because that is what I do now. I help people read the fine print. The galaxy is not fixed. It will not be fixed by one broadcast or one working group, or one stubborn species that refused to sign a document. The structures that were built over 11,000 years will not be dismantled in 12 months. There are species that benefited from the old system and will fight to preserve it. There are species so deeply integrated into the Council's framework that withdrawal would cause genuine economic and social upheaval. The path forward is long, and it is messy, and it will involve the kind of argument and compromise and frustration that humans seem to thrive on, and that most galactic species find deeply uncomfortable. But the conversation has started, and that is something the old Council never allowed. For 11,000 years, the compact was not questioned because questioning it was not something anyone thought to do. Not because they were stupid, not because they were weak, because the system was designed to make questioning feel unnecessary. The offer was so generous, the protections so reassuring, the technology so transformative, that asking "what's the catch" felt ungrateful. And no species wanted to be the one that looked the galaxy's greatest gift in the mouth. Until humanity did. I sit in my office now, 43 floors above a city that never stops moving, never stops arguing, never stops questioning. I have a meeting in an hour with delegates from 2 species that are considering joining the working group. They have questions. Many questions. They want to understand the new framework before they commit, and they want assurance that they can leave if it does not serve them. And I tell them yes. I tell them yes because that is the first word of the new framework, the word that makes everything else possible. Yes, you can question the terms. Yes, you can negotiate the provisions. Yes, you can leave. Yes, you will be heard. Yes, your sovereignty matters. We spent 11,000 years building a galaxy on the word no, not the kind of no that humanity said, which was a no that demanded better. The Council's no was different. No, you cannot withdraw. No, you cannot question the terms. No, you cannot defend yourself without permission. No, you cannot grow without oversight. No, you cannot leave. Humanity replaced that no with a question. One question, the same question they asked on the very first day, the question that started everything. What happens when someone wants to leave? And the answer that the galaxy is still learning to say, the answer that is rewriting 11,000 years of assumed consent, is simple. You let them go. Because a partnership that cannot survive one member walking away was never a partnership at all. It was a cage with comfortable furnishings. The humans taught us that, not with weapons, not with threats, not with any of the tools the galaxy expected a dangerous species to use. They taught us with a word, a question, and a broadcast from a basement. And the galaxy, for all its age and all its wisdom and all its power, is finally learning to read. Sometimes, late at night, when the building is quiet and the city's noise has softened to a distant hum, I pull up the old accession package on my personal terminal. The same package I carried to dozens of worlds. The same document I presented with a smile and a handshake, and absolute confidence that I was offering something wonderful. I read it now with different eyes. With human eyes, or as close to human eyes as my biology allows. And I see what they saw from the very first day. I see the generosity that was real, and I see the control that was hidden inside it, like a blade inside a gift. I think about the species I helped integrate. The Voron, who accepted in hours. The Drelkathi, who wept with joy. I wonder how many of them, if they had been given the time and the information and the stubbornness that humanity brought to the table, would have said no too. I wonder how many of them wanted to say no but could not imagine it was an option. The humans imagined it. That was their gift. Not technology, not weapons, not strategic brilliance. Imagination. The ability to look at a system that everyone else accepted as natural and inevitable and say, this does not have to be this way. I close my terminal. I go home through streets that are never truly quiet, in a city that is never truly still, on a planet that is never truly at peace with itself. And I think that maybe that is exactly why it works. A species that is never at peace with itself is a species that never stops questioning. And a species that never stops questioning is a species that will never sign something it has not read. The galaxy needed that. It needed it more than FTL drives, or military protection, or medical technology. It needed someone to ask the question that no one else would ask. What happens when someone wants to leave? The answer changed everything. And a species that still burns hydrocarbons, that still argues about everything, that still points weapons at itself while extending an open hand to the stars, gave us that answer. You let them go, and if they choose to stay, you earn it. Every day, every year, every millennium, you earn it by being worth staying for. That is the new compact, not a document, not a treaty, not a set of clauses and subclauses designed to be signed and forgotten, a principle, simple, difficult, and human. You earn it, or you lose it. And for the first time in 11,000 years, The galaxy understands that there is a difference.